Several major upsets in the Western world leave Americans and Brits guessing more than usual how to navigate the future. First, the United Kingdom votes to leave the EU.
There's a huge economic consequence, and the biggest economic consequence, which has everyone just going nuts, is the city. And the city of London is the financial center, I'll say, of the world.
Then Donald Trump becomes the president-elect.
Alternatively, it could be as severe as President Trump not only ending the program, but also using all of the information that these individuals provided to get DACA status to then go and actively put them into deportation proceedings.
Join us for this edition of Wyoming Signatures. Good evening and welcome to Wyoming Signatures. I'm Mary Young. The election of Donald Trump, his announced picks for cabinet positions, and plans for appointing a new U.S. Supreme Court justice have created great unease for many living in this country. We're going to spend some time tonight addressing these concerns. We start with the future direction of LGBTQ rights. Co-chair of the Shepherd Symposium for Social Justice, Christi Boggs, tells our Pat Wolfenbarger a great deal could be at stake.
Donald Trump has been elected the next president of the United States. What are the concerns among the LGBTQ community?
So I think that the concerns that I've heard, for the most part, have been on three levels, really. They've been on a national scale, so things like marriage equality and hate crime legislation. They're on a statewide level when we talk about anti-discrimination laws and, once again, hate crime legislation. And religious freedom laws as well, and then also on a very personal level having to do with harassment and bullying and personal attacks of that kind. So I think that's where most of the concern comes from.
What is the prospects in Wyoming for addressing these issues, as you talked about, if the policies are going to be turned to a state's focus?
The thing with the states, we haven't passed any legislation in Wyoming, hate crimes or anti-discrimination legislation of any kind to protect the LGBTQ community in any way. So basically, in Wyoming, and there's not a national anti-discrimination law as well. They've been debating that for about 40 years, and to add that to the protected groups, but hasn't happened. But many states have it. Wyoming does not, which basically means that if an employer decides that he or she wants to fire you based upon your being queer in some way, then they can, and there's nothing you can do to fight that back. And we don't have, there is a national hate crimes legislation, but we do not have a state one for that either. And so there's not a whole lot to take away, I guess, at this point in Wyoming. And so I think, but there have been, the last legislative session, we were within 5 votes in the House of passing an anti-discrimination bill. These aren't necessarily partisan issues. This crosses partisan boundaries, and as we know, we have a very small representation of Democrats in our legislature. So when we get within 5 votes of passing it, we clearly have a lot of support from both sides of the political spectrum.
What kind of prospects do you see for what individuals can do to express their concerns? What kind of prospects do you see for groups to express their concerns?
When you look at the history of, say, marriage equality, the fight for marriage equality, one of the most successful things that has ever happened as a political movement is the coming out of the closet movement, which was basically telling people that you worked with, that you were surrounding yourself with, that you were queer in some way. And that was hugely successful because that brings things down from that national level we started with down to a very personal level, and many individuals are much less obstructionist and hateful on a very personal level. It's only when they're kind of these abstract groups that they don't understand. And so that was incredibly effective. Like the speed with which that happened had a lot to do with that. So I guess I would say on an individual level, continuing that kind of work is super important. I think especially in Wyoming, because despite what many people outside of Wyoming may think, Wyoming actually creates a community in which accepts a lot of different groups much better than some areas do. One of my mentors, Maggie Murdoch, likes to say that the idea of the lone cowboy isn't exactly what Wyoming community is about. It's about the branding, and what she means by that is that every single individual in a community or involved with a certain ranch has to help brand every man, woman, child, everybody, and that requires everybody's help to be successful and make that work. And so that kind of attitude in Wyoming can be helpful. And so, letting people know that you're concerned about this, and letting people know that even if you're an ally, letting people know that you have, that you're concerned about it, that you have friends or you have, relatives, and just making that an open thing is very helpful. I do think that we've seen a huge influx into many of the groups that I'm a part of, as people try to align themselves in ways to support all types of diversity, and that's very helpful. And so the groups, I think, can be very vigilant and watch for policies, for things that, I was talking to Representative Kathy Conley the other day, and she was saying she expects a couple of anti-LGBTQ laws to be proposed in the legislature this year, and being diligent on that. One of the coolest things in Wyoming is that we actually have a kind of a relationship with our legislatures, and calling them and sending them personal emails and really actually have an impact. And so those are the kind of things that I think individuals and groups can do, really get involved with what happens if you're concerned about what's happening. Getting involved with the legislature and calling representatives and just telling them what you think about these things. People don't think that hate is a Wyoming value for the most part, and I think that is true, but I think that you still need to be diligent and pay attention, because there's a lot of things that can go wrong when you're just kind of letting it go. This particular issue is interesting because I think that the reason the coming out thing was so successful was because it's an invisible marginalization, right? And so you can float around and kind of, as opposed to you don't have to come out if you're Latinx, right? You can see that, but you can't always see that. And so the people would, and you get this in Wyoming. One of the not obvious, that there's a better word for this, but things in Wyoming is the idea that of a form of oppression is just saying, well, we don't have any diversity in Wyoming, which is just simply not true at all. But by saying that, then you're just marginalizing these entire swaths of people. And so, but when you start saying, well, actually, there's 3 people in your school that actually identify as queer in some way, and then they're like, whoa. I've had colleagues that know me that say, I don't know anybody who's a lesbian or gay, and you're like, actually you do, silly you, and so but they don't, and so the more you let them know that, the better, I guess, the better. The more you move forward, I guess, to a certain extent.
Thank you for being with us today, Christi.
My pleasure.
Recipients of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA, are another worried sector. Donald Trump's comments about immigrants, both legal and illegal, during his campaign, and the voting record of most House Republicans to defund DACA right after its implementation have foreboding implications for those now covered under this policy. Director of the Center for International Human Rights Law and Advocacy at the University of Wyoming, Suzan Pritchett, goes into more detail with our Rachel Wagner.
Just kind of give us an overview, a little history on the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals.
Sure. The Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program came about really after the failure of something called the DREAM Act. And the DREAM Act was a proposed bill that made its way through Congress, which the proposal was to give status to individuals who had been brought here as children, had essentially grown up in the United States. Oftentimes, some of these kids speak English better than they speak any of the languages of their home countries. And the DREAM Act was a bill to give them a pathway to citizenship. Unfortunately, that did not meet with congressional approval. And so in the wake of that failed legislative action, President Obama decided he wanted to do what he could within his executive authority to give these kids who otherwise would have benefited from the DREAM Act some sort of reprieve from deportation here in the United States. And so what he did was grant prosecutorial discretion for individuals who met a certain criteria, usually that they had to have come when they were children, they have to have been come without authorization or have come on a visa but fallen out of status, have been in the United States by a certain date, and have no criminal history, essentially, or no serious criminal history. And if an individual was able to meet that criteria, they would be promised that they wouldn't be actively deported for a 2-year period of time. And during that period of time, they would qualify for work authorization. And under our system, if you are a recipient of work authorization from the immigration authorities, you can then go and apply for a Social Security card. Oftentimes, work authorization is often a pathway to getting a driver's license. Certainly here in Wyoming, that is the case. And so this Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program opened up a pathway for individuals who otherwise would have had some sort of permanent immigration status under the DREAM Act to at least come out of the shadows, get work authorization, get a Social Security number, and pursue things that we all are interested in doing, like going to school and working to support themselves.
So you mentioned it's only good for 2 years, then do they reapply?
So under the Obama administration, work authorization has been granted for 2 years, and then these DACA students or individuals have to go back to the government and reapply. So it is good only for a 2-year period of time. Now that being said, it's not a law, and so it's just merely a policy of President Obama, which means that with a new president coming into office in January, that policy might change for all of those individuals who are currently under this program.
So President-elect Trump has mentioned that he would repeal Obama's executive orders. What might happen when he takes office?
That is perfectly within his purview as a president. Like I said, it's not a law. It wasn't passed by Congress. It's merely a policy that President Obama put in place and an order telling his immigration and customs enforcement officials not to enforce the immigration laws against this select group of people. President Trump could decide to end that program. And what that would look like is still uncertain. It could simply mean that people are no longer eligible to either initially apply for DACA or they're no longer eligible to renew their DACA work authorization. Alternatively, it could be as severe as President Trump not only ending the program, but also using all of the information that these individuals provided to get DACA status to then go and actively put them into deportation proceedings.
So those people wouldn't necessarily be grandfathered in to any sort of...
They're technically not in any immigration status and are, under the law, removable or deportable from this country. And so unless there's another pathway for them to find some sort of immigration status, they are at risk for deportation, and there's really nothing that they can rely on for protection in the means of saying, I was once in DACA status and I thought I was safe. That unfortunately, that argument most likely will not prevail in removal proceedings.
So what are the potential implications for those that are currently in DACA?
Individuals who have DACA status are in a really difficult position at the moment, and there's a lot of fear, and I sympathize with that because so much is unknown. One of the main areas of concern is that President Trump will actually actively try and remove all of these kids who benefited from this program. And there's all sorts of checks on that process. Of course, before somebody is removed from the United States, they generally get a hearing before an immigration judge. Our immigration courts are really backlogged and overloaded at the moment, and so in order to get every individual who's in DACA a removal hearing would take a really, really long time to work itself through the immigration bureaucracy. But it might simply be that individuals in DACA status just are no longer allowed to renew it, but they're not actively being deported. And that can have different consequences. Of course, if you had a driver's license and you want to renew that driver's license, but you need work authorization, you're no longer going to be able to do that if you once had work authorization under DACA. I know of several students here at the university who are in DACA status and are going to graduate schools on graduate assistantship sources of funding, and that comes through being paid, right, with the Social Security number. And so individuals who are relying on that type of funding may no longer be eligible for that funding to support their education. So those are a couple of big immediate implications, but of course there's still the overarching psychological consequence of this, which is that a lot of individuals are now living in fear and uncertainty because what they once thought was going to be something helpful to them for the foreseeable future is now under question.
Okay. So work authorizations are separate from DACA, correct? It's a separate...
So if you qualify for deferred action under the Obama's executive order, the kind of a reward that you get for qualifying is work authorization, and that must be attendant to some sort of either immigration status or policy directive allowing you to apply for work authorization from immigration. And so really, unless somebody who was once in DACA status has another means by which to get work authorization, so applying for a green card, marrying a U.S. citizen, having a viable claim for asylum. Those are other ways of going about getting work authorization, but that it's a really case-by-case analysis, and not every person who's in DACA will necessarily have another means of going about qualifying for work authorization.
Okay, so what should DACA recipients do right now?
I mean, that's tough, and I've been in conversations with a lot of students here at the university. And so much is unknown, and so we're having trouble answering those questions at the present time. Just recently, I think President-elect Trump said that he wasn't as interested in deporting all of these DACA students, and that he was committed to finding some sort of workable solution going forward. We will have to wait to see what that looks like. But in the meantime, I think it's really important for individuals to continue to do what they've been doing, which for most DACA students is going to school or working or being a meaningful participant in their communities. There are some basic rights that apply to everybody in the United States, regardless of your immigration status, such as, not consenting to a search of your home without being presented with a warrant, requesting that a lawyer be present anytime you talk to law enforcement officials. And those rights still remain even for DACA recipients who might be facing an enforcement action by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So I think it's good for all of us, but especially those in DACA status, to brush up on those basic constitutional rights.
How many people in Wyoming are affected by DACA?
So my research has, this may not be exactly right, but I think about 600 individuals in Wyoming have applied for and received DACA status, and that was maybe a statistic that was accurate as of 2015. So we have a surprising number, considering the small size of our population, of individuals who have been able to apply for and get work authorization under this executive order.
Okay. Suzan, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
On the other side of the Atlantic, the United Kingdom is also facing a great deal of uncertainty as a result of its spring vote to divorce itself from the European Union. That vote stunned many observers in this country, and now the world awaits the exit terms negotiated between the UK and the EU. University of Wyoming political scientist Stephanie Anderson focuses her research on the European Union.
Were you surprised by the Brexit vote?
Oh, I was very surprised. I turned on the BBC and I was watching at 10 o'clock at night my time, which was 7 hours later in the UK, and so my family was watching when they called it that Britain would leave, and boy, there was an exclamation from Laramie, I can tell you, at that time.
What were the reasons that had you surprised?
Well, this was a real rejection of mainstream politics. Since Eisenhower. Eisenhower was very much into European integration, as was Winston Churchill. Jean Monnet was the father. This has been American policy, to be frank, as well as European policy since, 1945. So to have a wholesale rejection by one of the most important countries in the European Union, this was a shock for me.
What are the potential downsides for the UK as this process evolves? I mean, it's going to be a very complicated process from what I understand. Let's take that question first. It's a very, very complicated process.
It is, and I think that's what really got people by surprise. I think people thought, well, we're in, we're out. Maybe in the same way someone gets a divorce. It's like, well, we'll just divorce. But once you look into, the kids, the pets, the house, the finances, there are so many legal questions that have to be unwound. And I don't think people were thinking about any of this when they voted no. I think, as in many referendums, many elections, when people are angry, they vote no, and they don't really think about what the consequences are. But it's definitely a headache the next morning for all the bureaucrats, both the bureaucrats in Brussels and the civil service in the UK.
Once the legal process is started, there is a cap, though, a 2-year cap on how long it takes for the negotiations to occur?
Yes, that's true. So the Treaty on European Union is the treaty that binds all the member states together in the EU. And Article 50 says if a country wants to withdraw from the EU, it can. Now, they were very proud of this at first, especially compared to the United States. In the US, when a state wanted to secede, right, we had a civil war, and they were like, see, if a country wants to secede, we'll let them. But they never really thought that it would ever happen. They thought it would just be proof that everyone wanted to stay in the relationship. So there's a 2-year limit for the negotiations, because it's not supposed to be drawn out forever and ever. But right now, to show you how complicated it's getting, it looks like there's going to be another legal action saying that the European Commission and the Council designed this Article 50 poorly. You should be able to revoke it. In other words, if it goes before Parliament and the Parliament does not like the deal to get out of the EU, they should be able to vote against it and still stay within the EU. In other words, this 2-year time limit, this irrevocable nature of it, they believe is a serious constitutional problem.
So then there's a possibility that Britain may not leave.
There is a possibility. There's a whole question, if you're familiar with Ladbrokes, the Brits like to gamble on these things. For example, for our election, they had 10-1 whether Trump would win or Hillary Clinton and the like. And so there was a question as to whether, one, Article 50 would ever be invoked, and second, whether they would really leave. So there's always a question, there's a lot of uncertainty. Prime Ministers John Major and Tony Blair have already called for a new referendum. So there's a lot of uncertainty out there. I predict something will change. The question is whether it'll be, same bottle with a new label, or if it'll be something qualitatively different.
We're hearing about what the terms of the negotiation might be. In other words, that Britain would like to have a tailored, custom-made agreement. What do you think is going to come out of all this?
We don't really know, but here's some stuff I can tell you. So Switzerland has just negotiated a special agreement with the EU, and they have a policy. So free movement of people is the real issue here. And let me just give a little bit of background to everyone about what's going on. So the European Union has 4 freedoms: freedom of goods, freedom of services, freedom of capital so that you can bring your money anywhere, and free movement of people so you can get a job anywhere. And the idea is just like if you're in Wyoming and you want to work in Colorado, you can do it, right? If you want to go to Alaska and work, you can do that. And so the EU actually mimicked the United States in this way. Jean Monnet, the father of European integration, he was very much influenced by his time in the United States. And he wanted anyone, if they wanted to work in another country, that they could. But the problem is our jobs for people at home. And so the Brits were saying they don't want to have the immigrants come in, and the Swiss were saying that too. And so now in Switzerland, they still have free movement of people, but Swiss get priority for the jobs. So a question is, could the UK negotiate a similar agreement? The answer is possible, right? There's something on the table. But that would be what's called a soft Brexit. And the hard Brexit is we're cutting our ties. There's no movement, free movement of anything.
What are some of the downsides for the UK?
There are many downsides right now. One is uncertainty. In general, the Brits don't like uncertainty, so that alone makes people nervous, both inside the country and outside the country. The economists have said point blank that there would be a problem with that the economy would shrink, the GDP would shrink, and already we see that the pound is at the lowest it's been in 35 years, I believe. So that's actually good for the economy, which is kind of odd, because when the currency is worth less, then all the goods are cheaper, and when the goods are cheaper, it's easier to export those goods overseas. So ironically, the stock market has gone up, even though the value of the pound has gone down. So some people are saying, see, all the economists were wrong. But that's just a temporary reaction to the change in the value of the pound, which has gone down because people have less faith in keeping the pound because they don't know what's going to happen with the Brexit. So there's a huge economic consequence. And the biggest economic consequence, which has everyone just going nuts, is the city. And the city of London is the financial center, I'll say, of the world, the financial center of the world. And it brings in billions upon billions of pounds to the UK. And it can no longer function as the financial center of the world if it can't have free movement of services, right, and capital to the rest of the EU. So this is really where the UK will suffer.
What about intelligence and other treaties?
I'm a little less concerned. You can always have treaties on those issues where like they're so small, you can probably make a technical exception for that. I would think a bigger, just to go another way, maybe we should talk about the existential crisis for the UK. And what do I mean by that? Will Scotland have another referendum to leave because they want to join the EU? Will the Good Friday Agreement between Northern Ireland and Ireland fail if all of a sudden there's a hard border between Ireland and Northern Ireland? So these are some, I think the intelligence is certainly an important issue, but these other issues are more existential, if you will, whether it'll exist as we know it today.
Well, what a cliffhanger. Stay tuned. The world is changing.
Yes, it is definitely changing.
Stephanie, thank you so much.
All right, my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
No doubt 2017 is going to be an exciting year. Happy holidays, everybody. Thanks from all of us here at UWTV for spending time with us this year. Happy New Year's, and as always, happy trails.